Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers. Let's sit around the campfire together and talk about
And now for something completely different.
It's Halloween, the time of year where the ghouls and goblins of the world come out to play, and seats in cinemas and living rooms alike fill with people huddled in front of a scary movie. For players of horror games and enjoyers of horror movies, it's a great time to indulge in our obsessions and really go ham on this massive popular celebration of horror media. So instead of talking about Dead by Daylight today, I want to take a look at a horror franchise that left a lasting impact on me far younger than it should have done. Saw. The first Saw movie that I recall being aware of was Saw 5, which came out just before my 10th birthday in the autumn of 2008. Of course, at that point I'd never seen a Saw movie, but something about the advertising that plastered buses, cinemas and TV channels really stuck with me. It was very different from most other adverts. There weren't any actors plastered over the posters, no smiling famous faces, just grotesque images of machines and body parts that got me curious. I distinctly remember age 10 or 11 searching up the traps on Wikipedia, because back then the Saw wiki didn't exist, and having endless sleepless nights, because my imagination went out of control at the thoughts of these horrifying devices. So when I first watched Saw years later at the age of 16, I was genuinely amazed to find that it really wasn't that bad. So I watched the rest, and I found myself madly in love with the Saw franchise and its characters and traps and themes, despite over half the movies in it being kinda crap. The arrival of the Saw chapter was the catalyst that got me into Dead by Daylight, and talking about it was one of the first videos that I made on this channel. And so I want to talk about Saw, specifically the 2005 sequel Saw 2. I believe Saw 2 is the definitive horror sequel of the 21st century, and one of the best horror sequels of all time. I'm not saying it's the best movie or anything, because there's so many other horror sequels to consider, but I'm saying it makes for a more effective sequel than almost any other horror sequel. Saw 2 succeeds perfectly at everything a sequel should do, and overshadowed the original movie both in scale and in depth. Because as great as the original Saw was, and remains to this day, the Saw franchise as a whole has been a single giant exercise to attempt to recapture the lightning in a bottle that was Saw 2. By taking the concept and ideas of the original Saw and expanding it to a larger scale movie with a whole different story beats, characters and themes, Saw 2 defined what a Saw movie is, and in doing so defined what horror was in the late 2000s. But what did it do that worked so well? The most obvious component in the success of Saw 2 is the main man himself, Tobin Bell's unhinged torturer, John Kramer. While the shadow of the Jigsaw killer hangs over the original Saw, the character of Jigsaw isn't really explored all that much. Our perspective on the Jigsaw is mostly through the eyes of the three main point of view characters: Dr. Lawrence Gordon, Adam Stanheight, and Detective David Tapp. The big revelation about who Jigsaw is only comes at the end of Saw. John's identity answers a question the film continuously posits throughout its runtime. Who is the Jigsaw killer? He's a sick old man who is misdiagnosed by Dr. Gordon and believes that those who waste their life that he was denied should be tested to see if they deserve the comfy lives they have. So when Saw 2 came around, writers Lee Winnell and Darren Lynn Bousman decided to follow the logical progression of this. We know that the Jigsaw killer is John Kramer now, but who's John Kramer? From the start, John was always set up to be quite different from most slasher villains. He's a meticulous planner, the kind of guy who spends the entirety of his first movie on the floor pretending to be dead, just to get a front row seat as his plan unfolds. He's a non-action villain, which you don't see very often in horror, and Saw 2 decided to play into that even more than the original movie by how the filmmakers portrayed the power dynamic between John and the rest of the cast. Most horror villains are fearsome because of their strength or durability or inability to escape them. But a core part of how Saw 2 presents John is his weakness. The first time we see John in the flesh, the police are battering down his door at the Wilson Steel Mill to put a stop to his games. This scene here is my favourite in the entire Saw franchise, because it should be a triumphant moment for the police. The serial killer that destroyed so many lives in the original Saw has been caught red-handed and apprehended by the law. And when they arrive, John is almost completely without resistance. Beyond a trapped staircase that the police easily push through, John has no choice but to surrender to the police and let Eric Matthews, the sleazebag cop who has drawn his attention, mock him to his face. But let me tell you why this conversation between Eric and John is my favourite scene in Saw. As the scene rolls on, the balance of power between John and Eric shifts slowly and inexorably towards John. And it starts with this realisation from Eric.
I think that's my son.
What follows is a display of Eric trying to put his power over the situation to use in an attempt to save his son. He shouts and lunges at John, but the old man in the wheelchair is completely unfazed. Eric's buttons are pushed and he realises that John knew Eric would come for him, and abducted Daniel as a security measure. Eric gets irritated at John taunting him. He tries calling Daniel, but all he hears is John's mocking voice again, reminding him that with all his police and all of that power, he can't even protect his own son, the son that he pushed away. And so he has to return to John despondent, and the camera angle shifts to reflect who really holds the power now. The wheelchair John's confined to frames him like a throne, as the big strong cop has a sit down with the dying old man and do what he always had to do. Play the game. And there's so many little details, from the safe place that hint at Daniel's location, to John's assurance that his son is sitting in the corner with a look on his face, hinting that he's already seen the footage from the house, that make this scene even more impressive on rewatches. You get to fully understand the levels on which John messes with Eric and the other police if you watch this scene again, knowing the details of the ending. You can appreciate how truly out of their depth the police are, and how, despite everything, John was always holding the power in the situation. John's physical frailty is a core plot point in every Saw movie since, with his deterioration and death in Saw 3 leading to the lineage of successors who would take the mantle of the Jigsaw killer in the later sequels. And yet it's this scene, more than any other, that legitimises John as a true threat. No matter how disadvantaged John Kramer appears to be, he's always the man with the power in the room, and that's what makes him such a frightening and memorable villain. And it's buoyed by Tobin Bell's legendary performance that perfectly balanced both his physical degeneration since the original Saw and the self-assured charisma that reminds us he's still in control. Speaking of characters who've had their power removed from them, Saw 2 provided a perspective on Jigsaw's victims that veers strongly away from that of the original movie. The first Saw was very focused on the victims. The only time the narrative ever left the bathroom, outside of flashbacks, was to follow Detective Tapp's subplot, and contextualise the arrival of Zepp Hindle towards the end. The entire rest of the story was just Lawrence and Adam together in a room, working out how to escape. That was a very deliberate choice by James Wan and Lee Winnell that differentiated Saw from its inspiration 7, which focused more on the police officers solving the crimes and only finding the victims post-mortem. Saw 2 picked a middle ground between these two perspectives, as it juggled two parallel narratives. The victims in the nerve gas house, and Eric and John's conversation in the Wilson Steel Mill. This not only allowed the very cool and epic twist to come into play late into the movie, but also allowed us to get a good view of John without ignoring the victim's plight altogether. The way the group of victims is set up is part of the formula that later Saw movies would try to replicate. Most notably the Fatal Five in Saw 5 and the victims of the Tuck Barn in Jigsaw. There's the young man who doesn't really know what's going on or why he's there. There's the calm and practical woman who tries to protect that person as well as themselves. And that one arsehole who seemingly exists just to make everything worse for everyone, including themselves. And then there's the rest of them. The run-of-the-mill people whose lives have taken a few wrong turns but don't really deserve the hardship that Jigsaw puts them through, and are mostly just trap fodder, so that the film can get some gory kills without putting our actually story-relevant characters in harm's way. Unlike the later movies, Saw 2 uses the sealed room at the beginning of the gas house segment to actually introduce these characters and give them something to do that isn't just screaming and dying horribly. This both builds up the tension as the panic in the room builds up, and gives each new character a bit of breathing room, pun intended. Daniel is the aforementioned lost young man, Xavier is the aggressive asshole, Obby's secretive and insular, Jonas is agreeable and proactive, Addison is understandably defensive, Laura's terrified to the point of apathy, and Gus is so stupid that he broke the rules of the game and got himself killed more or less instantly. And all these roles are established before the first trap is even unveiled, by how they react to waking up in a strange room full of people they never met. That's a super critical step in setting up characters we've never met before. Even if they're going to die, at least give them some small way of establishing themselves before the blood starts flowing, because otherwise their deaths will have no emotional impact. That's why I struggled to remember what's his name with the Venus flytrap on his head, or most people in John's earlier traps in the original Saw, because they're just randos who appear to get a bit of a torturing before they die. On the flip side, we start to care for characters like Addison and Jonas. It feels bad to see Addison stuck in the razor box trap, knowing the key is right in front of her, and it hurts to see Jonas try to reach out to Xavier, only to have him beaten to death before he gets a chance. And that matters, that has emotional impact, because these characters were introduced outside of the context of a trap. We're with the residents of the gas house for a long time, so we have to be able to understand who they are and why their deaths should mean anything to us, even though they're entirely new characters. Well, not entirely new, but we'll talk about Amanda's involvement and the impact of her twist ending later. But before we get round to her, I want to talk about the other big twist. A twist so well done that the Saw franchise would go on to try and replicate it 7 more times and fail miserably every single time. Let's wind it forward a bit to the midpoint of the third act, where both halves of the story are falling apart at the seams. Most of the residents of the gas house are dead, and none of the antidotes to the nerve gas have been claimed, meaning Xavier, Amanda and Daniel are all living on borrowed time, as Xavier hunts them down to collect the numbers on their necks, and claim his chance at escape. The 2 people that we've been conditioned to root for more than any other are quite literally at death's door. Meanwhile, John's game with Eric back at the steel mill has also gone south, with John seemingly capitulating to Eric's brutal beatdown and agreeing to guide Eric to the gas house to save his son. The bomb squad has found where the video broadcasts are coming from and are in hot pursuit. The tensions are running high. Will the police and Eric get to the gas house in time to save Eric and Amanda? That on its own would be a fairly exciting, if slightly underwhelming ending to the movie. The police get there just in the nick of time, Xavier is stopped and the day is saved. And between him seemingly breaking under Eric's assault and the events of the gas house spiralling out of control, it looks like John's plans are in tatters. Eric broke the rules and effectively cheated at the game, and he's reliant on the police to intervene because his game didn't plan for Xavier to go completely off the rails. Throughout the whole story, John's never been so powerless. But when you're dealing with a Jigsaw killer, it's never quite that simple. 3 little words are all it takes to completely turn the movie's ending on its head.
It's not life.
Because suddenly the power dynamic between John and the police shifts again. Eric doesn't have the control over the situation that he thinks he does. John's been playing everyone from the start. He had a contingency plan in case Eric snapped and failed his game, or if the police tried to go over his head and track Daniel themselves. And the reason this twist has so much impact is because it didn't just trick the characters, it's also set up so well that the way the film was shot and edited tricked the audience too. John's not just outwitted the police, Saw 2 has outwitted us. And in doing so achieved something that very few movies have the combination of bravery and skill to accomplish. Not only did the villain end up winning in Saw 2, but you finished the movie with the sense that John thoroughly earned his win. In horror movies, the notion of the bad guy winning in the end isn't anything new. After all, the bad guys are why we watch most of these movies, so having him defeated once and for all is often a bit too much to ask of a studio trying to milk a franchise. But it's way too easy for the sudden reversal to often feel cheap. Putting the villain back on top after the good guys have worked so hard to beat them needs to be done with extreme care, so that the movie doesn't feel like a giant waste of time. But Saw 2 does this masterfully. The original Saw was criticised for having several serious plot holes that required some heavy-duty suspension of disbelief to justify John's success at the end of the movie, and you can tell that criticism was taken on board by Bousman and Whannell for Saw 2. Every piece of the puzzle that allowed John to come out on top was laid out early in the movie, and Eric's path to victory was always clear. Play the game and he'll see his son again. John didn't win because of some deus ex machina, or because the good guys were stupid enough to let him get away with it. He won because he planned for everything, and banked on Eric's emotional outbursts and attempt to cheat the game. Eric broke the rules by lashing out at John, and he paid the price for it. And so, despite the bad guy winning in the end and Eric never seeing Daniel again, we still end the movie with a twisted sense of satisfaction when the credits roll because it all felt earned. The twist itself, John's victory and Eric's defeat, it all happened for very good reasons. Saw has tried to replicate twists like this a good half a dozen times since then, manipulating how it presents flashbacks and the passage of time to try and make lightning strike twice, but it's never landed as well as Saw 2. Sure, you might look back on Saw 2 now and realise that it was a bit cliché with the dramatic music and the flashbacks, but you can't deny it works, and its impact on the rest of the Saw franchise and beyond was profound. But if we're going to talk about elements of Saw 2 that left a lasting impact on the franchise, I think it's impossible to go on any longer without talking about the elephant, talking about the pig in the room. Amanda Young. Amanda is fucking brilliant in this movie. For most of Saw 2's runtime, Amanda is established to be some sort of final girl of the Saw franchise. From the second that she wakes up in the sealed room, she's checking her head for the reverse bear trap that she had to wear in the original movie. She warns the others about the consequences of breaking John's rules, and has more insight into his methods and philosophy than the rest of the group does. She fits a similar role to Ellen Ripley in Aliens. She's familiar with the threat in front of her, and takes some amount of responsibility for the youngest and most inexperienced member of the group, who's mostly in trouble through no fault of their own. The twist about Amanda is so well known by now that it's no longer really a twist. But when Saw 2 came out, Amanda Young being revealed to be a secret apprentice of Jigsaw must have been quite the shocker. And that's actually where Saw 2 made its biggest impact on the franchise. The introduction of John's apprentices and the legacy of Jigsaw. The original Saw never really entertained the notion of John having successors. The only person who was ever seen helping him was Zepp Hindle, who was playing his own game and was effectively strong-armed into helping John execute his plans. But the idea of someone taking the mantle of Jigsaw after John's inevitable death gave the franchise some durability and opened up so many more avenues for future movies. Without Amanda as John's ace in the hole, to ensure the game ran smoothly and to catch Eric Matthews out of breaking the rules, the Saw franchise wouldn't have had a future. John's dying, that's kind of the whole point, and someone had to take up the mantle of Jigsaw when he went. Amanda's inheritance of the title opens up a very important question that changed audiences' perceptions of Jigsaw and his methods. How well do John's games work? The original Saw isn't really too sure. Amanda's clearly traumatised in her interview with Detective Tapp, but despite that she still insists that her experience in the reverse bear trap helped her overcome her addiction and value her life. And yet in the sealed room in the gas house, Amanda admits to resorting to self-harm after surviving the reverse bear trap. Something that John had punished people for doing before, and that led him to testing her again because, despite everything, she clearly hadn't learned her lesson yet. However, almost everybody watching Saw 2 on its own could easily disregard that scene as part of a lie because by the end, we all know that that's not why she's really in the game. Saw 2 has driven criticism more than any other Saw movie for legitimising John's philosophy, and I understand why. The only survivor of Jigsaw's games is so grateful for what he did to her that she follows him like a disciple. John's victims as a whole are given less development than Lawrence and Adam were in the original film. And because John earned his victory at the end of the movie more thoroughly, that could easily be construed as a validation of his methods. But it's worth remembering that just because John's methods appear to work, doesn't mean they're justified. At the end of the day, most of the gas house residents died horribly, and no more than 2 of them, Xavier and maybe Obby, deserved it. A prostitute, a shoplifter, a child. These people did not deserve to suffer at John's hands, and the movie never pretends that they do. They were victims of Eric Matthews' abuse of power, and John used them as pawns in the game he played with Eric. In his twisted mind, these people didn't make anything of themselves, and deserved to be tested just like Eric, despite him even acknowledging that their original convictions were illegitimate. He wants to make them better, but they were never the problem. They were victims of abuse, victims of the sick world personified by Eric Matthews. It's one of the reasons that Saw as a franchise is so interesting to me, because the world of Saw is indescribably fucked up. The original Saw showed us that both Lawrence and Adam, who looked like perfectly ordinary people, were far from angels themselves, but were also ultimately not evil people. But aside from them, the few other characters who get some spotlight, like Amanda and Detective Tapp, are more or less entirely presented as good people trying to make the best of their fucked up world that Jigsaw's throwing them into. Saw 2, however, expands that to, well, everyone. The police are violent and abuse their power, and even the cops who are actually dedicated to doing their jobs, like Alison Kerry, allow for their colleagues to do heinous things to civilians who do not deserve to be victims of that brutality. The highest authority in the world of Saw is seeping with corruption, and nothing looks set to change. John Kramer is a sick man, but the world around him is just as sick as he is. He's an incurable man trying to heal an incurable world, and in doing so causes far more harm than good. John's trying to do the right thing, but his bitterness and misanthropy, his sickness is so great that he can no longer come to terms with the human cost of his actions. Saw 3 ends up calling the efficacy of his methods into question, as the relationship between himself and Amanda is more thoroughly explored. But for now, Saw 2 is content to leave John to his victory. The film ends with Eric left to die in the bathroom and John triumphant. But he's not cackling like some evil overlord mocking the condemned. Instead, he's almost serene. He's gotten everything he wanted. His philosophy's been proven. He escaped from the police once again, and the legacy of Jigsaw is secure in Amanda's hands. So like any old man ready to retire, John is content to sit back for a bit and peacefully take stock of everything he's achieved. And that's the last thing we see of him before the half-dead shadow of John Kramer lying on that bed in Saw 3. The Jigsaw killer victorious and ready to rest. Saw is not a franchise known for having good sequels or a ton of deeper meaning. It's mostly just known as an intentionally provocative series full of elaborate contraptions, even more elaborate plot contrivances, and buckets of fake blood. But it's worth remembering that no matter what the critics say, if audiences can consistently come out and buy cinema tickets for the same franchise year in and year out, it's got to be doing something right. And everything that Saw has ever done right can be seen in Saw 2. I'm not going to say it's some forgotten masterpiece, because at the end of the day it's still dependent on some enormous suspension of disbelief, but a big part of the experience of watching Saw 2 is that the movie is good enough that you don't care. There was a lot of thought put into making Saw 2. More thought than I think it gets credit for, or that it maybe deserved. And the more attention you pay to the movie, the more you can appreciate that. Purists might dislike how different it is from the first one, but like it or not, the impact Saw 2 had on the franchise, and all of Saw's imitators going forwards, can't be understated. Think of Saw without the apprentices, without the assorted cast of misfits chosen by Jigsaw, without the corrupt police that was a concept carried all the way to Spiral. It wouldn't be the same, it wouldn't be Saw. And a Halloween without Saw is the scariest thought of all. Okay friends, that was everything I have to say on this fun little side project I was working on for a little while, this analysis of Saw 2. Given how hard it's been to enjoy DBD lately, I thought I'd try something a little bit different for Halloween, so do let me know if you enjoyed it. If this video does well enough, I might make this a full series and look at the full original trilogy of Saw movies, because they all mean a lot to me, and all have something very interesting to talk about. If you enjoyed it, then please do... You know the ritual at this point. In the description you can find links to my Discord, my Twitter, my Twitch, and my Patreon and Ko-fi links if you feel like this content is worth your money. Don't worry, DBD will be back next time, talking about either The Wraith or Stranger Things. Which one it'll be, I don't know yet, but we'll see. In any case, have a wonderful Halloween, and I'll see you all next time. Ta-ta for now.